She's been called Osama bin Laden's worst nightmare, thanks to her liberal views on Islam. And she's called for reform of her religion publicly, in both her book, The Trouble with Islam Today, and in her film, Faith Without Fear. But she's not without her critics, who say she's not trained in Islam, history, or even the Arabic language, and that her characterization of the Muslim faith is unfair and untrue. But none of this has stopped large numbers of Muslims and non-Muslims alike from flocking to her message. Hello, I'm Ernie Manoos. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with author, journalist, and activist Irshad Manji. What scares you?
I have to tell you, not much scares me. I refuse to live my life in fear. Now, there are those who would say, but you have to live your life in fear, and my mother would be among them. She certainly does, for me, fear what is coming down the pike. It's true that I have bulletproof windows at home. It's true that I know what to look for inside a car, under a car, around a car before I turn on the ignition. I've had police training in that regard, and it's true that I have bodyguards from time to time, on occasion more than one. But that's because I know I have to protect the people around me. It's not my life I worry about. And the reason I don't is not because I don't think I'll be blown away. I know that there's every possibility that I might. To me, however, courage is the recognition that some things are more important than fear. And what is more important than fear for me, living in the free society that I do, is having a voice. Finding it, then using it, on behalf of those who don't yet have the privilege of owning a voice.
When did you come to this decision, though?
Oh, gosh, years ago. I'll tell you the exact moment, actually, but I'll preface it with some context. I grew up in a pretty violent household. My father was abusive, not because of Islam, I have to add. He was a nominal Muslim at best. I remember one night my mother was working the graveyard shift at an airline company. She cleaned planes. And my father went on a rant at home about how he was going to kill her when she got home. And I said to him, Dad, if you do that one more time, if you touch her one more time, I will call the police and social services on you. His response was the best he knew how. He pulled out a kitchen knife and chased me through the house with it in his hand, threatening to amputate my ear. I flew up the stairs into my bedroom, out of the window, and scrambled up to the rooftop, and I stayed there for the entire night. And as I surveyed the neighborhood, I realized that evening, though I wasn't able to put it in these words, that I actually don't have to be stuck in the kind of situation in which my mother finds herself. That I live in an open-ended society, one in which the conclusion is not yet known, if ever it will be. And this is a society that is under constant renovation by virtue of the fact that it is free, which means that an individual like me, even at that age of 8, 9, 10, can contribute to the overarching story about us. So if the individual matters, Ernie, I had better recognize that I've got choices, and I'd better learn how to use them.
To get other people to make change, though, do they all have to have that moment? Do they have to have that eye-opening experience?
I think there has to be some kind of an experiential moment, not an intellectual one, not a theoretical one, not one that's gleaned from textbooks, but one that you feel in your gut. It has to be visceral, because otherwise it leaves you. You can rationalize it away, but that which is here in your conscience will never go away, even when you want it to.
Yeah. What was your mother's reaction to all of this?
I didn't tell her. I didn't want to put any more pressure on her plate than she already had. In fact, it was years later that she and I had that discussion. And only very recently, as a result of reading that story in my book, did she come to me and say, really? This happened? Yeah. I said, Ma, I know that you've blocked it out of your memory, and I understand why. For self-preservation, you've had to. But you know, we talked about this years ago, and I'm not holding it against you. She feels terribly guilty about it all. But there's nothing for her to feel guilty about. I can tell you, as I did her, that even if she had been home that night coaxing me with assurances of safety to come down from the roof, I wouldn't have. Because that epiphany was central to me learning I, in fact, have the choice to develop a voice in this society. And that's what keeps me going. It's the gratitude for those kinds of moments. It's not anger. It's not resentment. It is sheer thanks for the freedoms that I've got in this part of the world to exercise on behalf of the millions of others who don't yet have them.
When you had these thoughts, when you were sitting up on that roof, when all this was going on, at that moment, did you look to your religion too? Was that when you started to notice, wait a minute, how can this be?
I began questioning even a couple of years earlier than that. But I'll tell you what that moment on the roof did teach me about life and about religion. That there's a difference between authority and authoritarianism. Authority can be legitimate. Good parents have authority. Great teachers have authority. Elected politicians, for better or for worse, have authority. Authoritarianism, on the other hand, by definition, is the abuse of authority. And that is never acceptable, no matter who is doing the abusing. And so, applying that to my religion of Islam, I soon came to realize that the problem is not faith itself. It is not religion itself. It is what people do in the name of that religion. And that is why I continue to ask really basic, but I think important questions at the Islamic religious school that I grew up in. And that is also why I got kicked out at the age of 14. But Ernie, I did not leave my faith. As I often have to remind my mother, just because I left the madrasa doesn't mean I left Allah. I took time over the next 20 years to study Islam on my own, and that is when I recognized that there are many beautiful aspects of the faith that, ironically, I would have never learned in that faith-based school.
Can you love Allah without being a Muslim?
I think so. And frankly, I don't believe you have to be a Muslim in order to pay tribute to the Creator, whatever you choose to call him, her, or it. People often ask me, because of statements like this, so you're a Muslim? I say yes, but there's a difference between being a faithful Muslim and a dogmatic one. Faith, it seems to me, Ernie, is secure enough to handle questions. Faith never needs to be threatened by questions. Dogma, anybody's dogma, does have to be threatened by questions because dogma is brittle. It's rigid, and it'll break under the spotlight of scrutiny. So I remind people, I'm a faithful Muslim, not a dogmatic one.
Talk a little bit about what happened when you were 14.
Well, the questions actually began at the age of 8, but I'll stampede through that to say my first question for my madrasa teacher was, why can't girls lead prayer? You'd think we were Catholic or something, huh? That's just my way of appreciating that it's not only Islam that has these problems, right? He told me, either you believe or you get out. Then I began asking him, where is the evidence for the so-called Jewish conspiracy against Islam? You love to go on about it, sir. Tell me, where is the proof? And at that point, he stamped his foot and said, get out. Clearly, you're not interested in being a Muslim. Get out of this school. And I remember standing up, adjusting my chadar, which is the long hijab that I wore at the madrasa, actually tucking the stray hairs underneath just so I could walk out like a proper Muslim girl, feeling a little bit itchy because of all the sweat building up underneath, walking past the boys, which was a bit of a scandal unto itself, kicking open the hefty door of the madrasa and yelling, Jesus Christ! Because I wanted to make a memorable exit. But little did I know how memorable it was, because I didn't realize at the time Jesus was a Jew. I really didn't know that.
So you do all of this, and you walk away, in a sense, from the teachings of your faith. How do you as a person not also assume that you've walked away from the faith? Why do you keep the faith, yet you can walk away from the teaching?
Well, you see, this is the key. I didn't walk away from the teachings at all. I walked away from the teacher, okay? From the person who was appointed happenstance to be my educator. But he was a lousy educator. Lousy because he did not teach us about the many beautiful aspects of the faith. Welcome to the other side of the teachings. For example, the fact that during the Prophet Muhammad's time, there was indeed a female prayer leader. It's just that we were never taught about her.
If you had had a different teacher, might all of this have been different today?
Maybe. But I must tell you that I don't regret not having had a decent teacher for two reasons. One is that, the questions that I asked and the very harsh responses that I got helped shape my understanding of how power is abused in all kinds of relationships and why we must stand up to that. It's called standing up for justice. Right? So I'm very grateful for those experiences. But the other reason that I don't regret having a lousy teacher is that it also forced me to go into other places to find the information that was being kept from me. And in this case, I went to none other than the public library, where at the time there were no shortage of books. Now there are even more, in which I learned, as I mentioned, that there was a woman leading prayers during the Prophet Muhammad's time. I learned something else that I was never taught at the madrasa, that the Prophet Muhammad's beloved first wife was a wealthy, self-made merchant for whom the Prophet worked for many, many years. She was his boss, so much so that she's the one who proposed marriage to him.
Now, why would hearing these things upset other Muslims?
I think that many Muslims, most Muslims even, are steeped in a very tribal mentality that is rooted in the cultures from which they come. Islam itself has the potential to be a very egalitarian religion. Ernie, most people in this part of the world don't realize that the Quran, Islam's holy book, gives women more rights than even the Bible and the Torah do. So if that's the case, then a legitimate question becomes, why do we overwhelmingly see interpretations that are against women? And this is where we come to the issue of culture, and in particular, Arab tribal culture.
So isn't that really what you're against, more so than fighting with Islam? Isn't it the interpretation of Islam that you have a problem with?
Correct. It is certain interpretations that have become mainstream, widespread within Islam. But the reason I can't simply say, therefore there's no trouble within Islam, is that the way in which certain cultural traditions have become insinuated into the religion itself means that they are being done in the name of my religion. And so they have become a problem for Islam and for Muslims. That is exactly why, Ernie, we Muslims are the ones who have to take responsibility for how we have corrupted a religion that started off as being about justice. We've corrupted it into an ideology of fear. And if anybody wants to deem this an anti-Islamic or un-Islamic message, I humbly remind them of what the Quran itself says. There's a gorgeous verse that says, God does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. This is a call to speak truth to power, no matter who's offended.
You're 14 years old. You've walked out of your classes.
Yeah.
You are in a Muslim family.
Yes.
How's your reaction at home? We already know your dad is pretty violent.
Mm-hmm. But because he's a nominal Muslim, he doesn't care. The fact that I've been kicked out, doesn't matter to him.
What about
it's my
your misbehaving, though?
Well,
did that bother him at all?
Of course it bothered him, but it bothered him first and foremost that I challenged his authority at home. Never mind anybody else's authority at the mosque or at the madrasa. It was my dear mother, a traditional, devout, 5 times a day on your rug to pray Muslim who's really mortified at this point. But you see, she's also very smart. She's lived with me long enough, even at this point, to know that if she tells me to go back to my madrasa teacher and beg for forgiveness, it so ain't gonna happen, right? Yeah. She knows I'm stubborn. So she doesn't tell me anything. It's up to me how I'm going to develop from here on in. And as a result of not shoving religion down my throat, I decide to go with my mother to the mosque, not the madrasa, which is the school, but to the mosque, the church, the temple, for the next 2 years. Until I realize, for reasons I explain in my book, my God, the mosque is just an extension of the authoritarian madrasa. And at that point, I have to make a crucial decision. Do I bolt from Islam altogether? Or do I stay and have Islam give me another chance and have me give Islam another chance? And out of fairness to my faith, I decide to take what turns out to be, didn't plan it this way, but what turns out to be the next 20 years to study Islam on my own at the public library. Now, I know I've already told you some of the things that I learned there, but I've only told you what I've learned about women. Let me also tell you very quickly that while I studied at the library, I also learned that the Prophet Muhammad, in his farewell sermon to Muslims, declared women to be the partners, not the property of men. And maybe most intriguing for me as a budding young feminist, I learned that the first European feminist, was a Muslim man, a philosopher in Spain, a Spain that was ruled by Islam, 1,000 years ago. A philosopher who told the religious fanatics of his day, most of whom were Christian, that the reason women's ability is not yet fully known is that they are reduced to the business of procreating, breastfeeding, and child-rearing. And he went on to say that among the reasons great civilizations collapse into poverty is that they treat women as if they're a burden on men. Now, if Muslim men were capable of understanding this 1,000 years ago, there's a precedent for what we can be again as Muslims. So I'm not pulling anything out of thin air. I'm reminding my fellow Muslims that we once led the world in open-mindedness, in tolerance, scientific advancement, and artistic achievement.
Would they be hearing your message more, better, more completely if you were 5 times a day down on your rug praying toward Mecca, doing all of the things that are thought of to go along with being in Islam?
It's not entirely clear if they would. And I know that it would be easy for me to say, yeah, maybe, but I have to be who I am. I don't even think it's clear that my message would be better received by Muslims if I was more traditional. And I'll tell you why. Soon after Islam was established as a religion, the very first dissidents began to emerge from the woodwork. They were men. They were Arab. They had all of the credentials that made them legitimate. And still, Ernie, they were accused of being in the pay of the Jews. Okay, even 1,300 years ago. So if these guys couldn't get the cred, to have their message accepted warmly, what are you going to expect from a young, spiky-haired, feminist, Western-raised Muslim woman who loves the notion of both finding her voice and then helping others develop it?
Okay. Had you been a boy, would this be different?
Maybe. But you could ask that of Salman Rushdie, right?
Yeah.
The author of the Satanic Verses, who had to go into hiding for several years. And he was born in India, though raised in Britain. My point is that at a certain juncture, one has to let go of the what-ifs and really rely on integrity. See, I'm the only one who lives in my skin 24/7. I have to be able to put my head down on that pillow every night, knowing that I've been honest with myself and the rest of the world, whatever the consequences.
And there are a lot of critics that say you haven't been. The critics would attack you and say, you're just taking the pieces you need, the parts you want, the parts that support your argument. How do you counter that? They'll say you're not a scholar.
Right. They say all of those things, and the point is that I've never claimed to be anything that I'm not. I've never claimed to be a scholar. I'm a journalist who believes in doing what good journalists do, which is comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. They say that I pick and choose from the Quran. Everybody does. That's because the Quran, like the Bible, like the Torah, is rife with ambiguities, inconsistencies, and dare I say it, even contradictions. So that any interpretation is exactly only that, an interpretation. I'm the one who's honest about the fact that I choose to play up certain passages, pro-diversity passages, and downplay the pro-violence passages.
And help me with this, because I have not studied Islam. But as I understand it, to be a Muslim is to give total faith over to Islam. To Allah.
Well, to God, yes, is to submit to God's will. Now, here's the thing. I believe I do that. I've made it very clear to my audiences that no matter where you open up the Quran, which is supposed to be God's word for Muslims, you will never be far from three key messages. First, that only God knows fully the truth of anything. Second, as a result, only God can reward belief or punish disbelief, since only God knows what true belief and disbelief are. Mm-hmm. And the third message is that as a result of those first two messages, we Muslims have to be humble enough not to play God with one another, so that we are free to explore what God's message really is, and that not only are we free to do that, but that we have to ensure others, Christians, Jews, atheists even, are free to explore. Why? Why should their rights be guaranteed too? Because anything less undermines God's jurisdiction as the supreme judge and jury.
So why do you know these things and the imams and so many of the leaders of your faith don't seem to know them? Or do they know them and just choose not to share them?
I believe it's the latter.
Why?
Politics, I think
but
that...
in today's day and age, isn't it truly hurting them? If in fact
what?
If in fact these are the true messages that are in there, and we're looking at the turmoil in the world today, why are they not standing up and saying, really, it should be about this, it should be about that? Why are they letting these misconceptions continue?
First of all, there's that F word again, fear. Fear of losing power. Fear of being seen as weak by your own congregations, fear of where curiosity will lead you. Imagine it might lead you to the D word, doubt. There's a whole lot of fear that has infested all religions, not just Islam. But the fear that has infested Islam has become deadly. And therefore, it has also calcified into a fear of one's own life, one's own security. And so a lot of younger Muslims, let's put the imams aside for a second, even those who are going to be mandated with defining Islam in the future, even they, Ernie, after many of my lectures on university campuses, come up to me to say, Irshad, I really support what you're doing, but you realize I can't say that out loud, because if I do, I will be stalked, and the girls often say to me, I will be raped. And this is in America.
If you're hearing that, then, do you have belief, hope, that in the neest generation we're going to see this change?
I do have hope, actually. I couldn't do this if I didn't have hope. And let me explain why I say I've got hope. First of all, I have evidence that many, many, many younger Muslims are beginning to open up and ask questions freely. In fact, this is delicious. The most common question that comes to me through my website is from young Muslim women and men from around the world who have fallen in love with non-Muslims. And their parents and imams tell them, no, Islam forbids you from marrying the person you love. And they come to me and say, is that true? Well, who cares what spiky-haired feminist Irshad Manji has to say, right? Even I'm being strategic on this one. I found a progressive imam, of all places, California, God love the Californians, who came up with a theological defense of interfaith marriage from an Islamic perspective. My point simply is that an emerging generation of Muslims is beginning to ask questions rather than swallow uncritically what their authorities are telling them. But here's the other reason that I'm very optimistic. I think that with more and more voices of dissent, eventually we will find voices of reform. And why do I make the distinction between the two? I'm a dissenter. Okay, I will never be a reformer. I will not have the credibility to be one. But I'm a dissenter. And dissenters, by definition, do two things. They break deadly silences, which is in and of itself an important legacy. But the second thing they do in breaking those silences is they create a space outside of themselves where those who later step into that space, saying the same things that the dissenters have been saying, will now be seen as much more legitimate, much more palatable, because the dissenters have raised the bar for what can be imaginable.
Is there a difference between dissenters and troublemakers?
Yeah, I do believe that there is a difference. Troublemakers, again, by definition, are there to cause trouble. It's not necessarily constructive. Dissenters, I believe, cause trouble for the sake of a bigger point, a bigger purpose, a bigger mission. And that is to heal what has gone wrong. And in fact, I have to bring it back to my mom at this point. You know, when my book first came out in Canada, which is the country in which I live, my mother went to the mosque 2 weeks later. She heard a scathing sermon about me. But the individual congregants came up to her afterwards to say, don't you worry, what Irshad has written absolutely needs to be expressed. And she called me that night to say, this is what I needed to hear in order to be convinced that what you have done, you've done with the right intention, and that is to heal the faith.
In the last couple seconds we have left, looking at the world today, is there a way to solve all these problems?
Yep, I think that there is. All of these problems. Big task you've just given me in 2 seconds, eh? Don't think I haven't busted you on that, all right?
I'll give you like 30 seconds to answer it. That's what you have.
I believe it starts with a very simple yet radical act of freedom, and that is to ask questions out loud. We don't ask enough questions, even in a free society, because we fear. We fear, we fear being ostracized by our communities. We fear offending minorities in a multicultural world. We fear the consequences of the solutions that will be exposed when we actually break these silences. But solutions are never something to be feared. It is the inaction that keeps us, obtuse to those solutions. Ask questions out loud.
And that is where we run out of time. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Salam, which means peace.
Irshad Manji.
To order a transcript, call 866-652-3378 or send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.